Welcome back to the next segment for the 10 Essential Principles of Implementation Leadership. In Part 1, you learned about the background of implementation leadership, as well as the first 3 principles of trusting the vision, dealing with Murphy, and how important it is that we lead others to be comfortable being uncomfortable. The CBCR initiative, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police now bring you to Part 2 of Implementation Leadership from ACGI. So once again, grab a notebook and a pen and enjoy Part 2 of this 3-part webinar series.
Principle 4, adapt or die. The idea with adapt or die is that as a change leader, we confront problems all the time and we want to go right to solutions because of the way that we operate. We get to a problem, or maybe somebody brings us a problem and they say, "Mrs. Change Leader, what do? I have a problem. How do I handle this?" And we want to get to a solution right away to help that person deal with the problem. As a change leader, we have to not get to the solution right away, and we have to stop and think and first diagnose our challenge. And we start with the idea that sometimes symptoms are cleverly disguised as problems. And the first question we should ask when we get to a problem situation is first, is this a symptom or a problem? If it's a symptom, then it's an artifact of something deeper, something bigger, maybe something even more complex. And if we believe that it's a symptom, we have to ask the question, what's it a symptom of? What is driving this symptom? If we can continue to answer that question, is what is driving this symptom, then we can start discerning the underlying root problem. Once we get to the problem, then we have to stop and diagnose that problem as either technical or adaptive. Technical problems are fairly black and white. You can think of technical problems as fairly easy to identify. They usually live in 1 or 2 places of the organization, and they can be solved fairly quickly and usually by somebody in authority position. So an example of a technical problem could be something like, we don't have the money to do this change initiative. So say, for example, we want to do incentives for clients or something like that. And we want to do that, we desire to do that, we aim to do that, but we don't have money to be able to do it. And the way we solve that problem is with money. We apply for a grant, or we ask the person in charge of the money, can I have some money to do this thing? They say yes, problem solved. That is an example of a technical problem that is solved with a technical solution. Adaptive problems are what are more dominant in organizational change initiatives and in implementation projects. Adaptive problems are difficult to identify, but they're easy to deny. They're more complex, and they're usually rooted in beliefs and attitudes and culture and mindset and things like that. And when we get to adaptive problems, they don't live in just one place of the organization. They live in many places of the organization, maybe even at the organizational cultural level. And so when we have adaptive problems, we don't have clear solutions. We don't have black and white tangible solutions. We can't just check a box and make sure that the problem is solved. When we have adaptive problems, we have to experiment. We have to try things. We have to fail. And adaptive problems require a lot of experimentation because the solutions are unclear and because the solutions rarely one size doesn't fit all. So I want to talk about another example of problem mutation, or when you solve an adaptive problem with a technical solution, it creates new adaptive problems. I was working one time with an organization, and the parole director came in and was charged with the responsibility to change the culture of the parole office. And the pre-existing culture of the parole office was very law enforcement oriented, and they wore black uniforms with their vests on the outside and had their badge and the chain on the end of the badge and showed their weapon, and that was their daily uniform. And they definitely looked like militarized or quasi-military law enforcement officers, and the new parole director wanted to change the culture away from a really hierarchical and militarized environment. He decided to say that I'm going to change the culture by changing the uniforms because I don't want parole to be perceived like a law enforcement agency. He was trying to get them to change to a more behavior change oriented organization. So he decided to change the uniforms and change the dress code for the parole officers and didn't really involve them much in the change. He thought that if he changed to civilian clothes and had a different type of uniform, that it would start to change the culture of the organization. So he announced to his staff that starting next month, on the first day of the month, we're going to start wearing khaki pants and a blue polo shirt, and it's going to have the organization's logo on it. And we're going to keep our badge in our pocket, and we're going to dress like civilians and act like civilians so that we can be behavior change oriented and not have that kind of wall between us and the clients that feels like law enforcement. Now, His thought to moderate the change was to pay for the new uniforms. So his big announcement to the staff were that we're changing your uniforms, you're going to wear civilian clothes, and because we care for you, we're going to help you pay for it. So they offered a stipend to help pay for the clothing. Now, as you can imagine, the problem that he started with was organizational culture. He wanted to change the culture, and culture is an adaptive issue. Culture is a complex problem. It's a complex scenario that lives everywhere in the organization where there's not clear solutions. So when he decided to apply the technical solution, which was changing uniforms, it didn't change the culture in a healthy way. It actually aggravated the parole officers towards the change. Imagine a situation where it was announced to you and you weren't involved in the change that we're going to change what you wear every day. We're going to try to change your identity, even though you were hired as a law enforcement officer and we look for your certifications as a law enforcement officer and you were trained as a law enforcement officer and you hang out with other law enforcement officers and we use law enforcement type of terms and we identify with the law enforcement identity. All that's going to be abated by new clothes. That's a technical solution to a problem that isn't technical. And as you can imagine, the parole officers were angry. It aggravated their pre-existing negative feelings about the change in their parole director. He didn't change the culture. He just kind of aggravated the staff because he didn't involve them in the change and he wasn't really addressing the cultural issue. He was addressing their clothes. Their clothes are a technical thing. Their thinking and their orientation and their identity, that's an adaptive thing. So that's an example that I like to use about problem mutation of when you have an adaptive problem and you solve with a technical solution. So again, in implementation situations, we ask first, is this a symptom or a problem? When we get to the problem stage, we start saying, is it technical or is it adaptive? And if it's technical, we apply a technical solution. If it's adaptive, we apply an adaptive solution. So say, for example, you're doing an implementation project and you're starting to sense that the staff are not buying into the change, or maybe the mid-level supervision is not buying into the change. And you solve that problem with a technical solution, which is maybe an order or a policy or a directive or some kind of performance management tool that says, you're not changing, you're not doing the right thing. I'm going to put it in your performance plan and make you change because it's my directive to you that you're supposed to change. So let's look at that situation. The team doesn't want to change. That's an adaptive problem because it's rooted in beliefs and it lives in the team and it's a little bit squishier and more ambiguous. And we solve that problem with a technical solution, which is a policy or a procedure or a directive or a performance tool. What really happens in that situation? We actually aggravate the pre-existing negative beliefs and negative attitudes about change. Because we've solved that adaptive problem with a technical solution, we've created yet another adaptive problem, which is aggravated feelings. Adaptive solutions are needed when we have adaptive problems, and those require experimentation and discovery, and they take time to perfect, and it's not real clear. In the Academy version of implementation leadership, we have a tool or a rubric that we give people to take a problem situation and go through some checking and to make sure that they effectively diagnose the problem. With this tool, they're able to stop and think and take a problem and say, based on this problem, the way that we've analyzed it, it looks more technical than adaptive, therefore we can apply a technical solution. Or the converse, where it looks more adaptive, it is more adaptive, so we have to experiment and we have to be a little bit more creative with our solutions. Eventually, people don't need this tool after the academy and they become more effective at being able to diagnose those problems that are either technical or adaptive. Because what we see in the real world is that problem mutation happens when we apply a technical solution to an adaptive problem. Problem mutation is when it actually creates more adaptive problems. Adapt or die is about stopping and thinking and diagnosing your challenge and saying, number one, is it a symptom or a problem? And when we find out that it's a problem, we diagnose it's technical or adaptive, and then we apply a technical solution to a technical problem and an adaptive solution to an adaptive problem. Principle 5, fail forward and fail often. For some reason in our culture, we have made failure somewhat of a virtue. A lot of times we believe that perfection is a virtue and failure is a vice, and I tend to believe the opposite. I think perfectionism is a vice and failure is a virtue, and that's what drives Principle 5. The idea is that if you want to increase your successes with change, we have to intentionally double our failures. We have to have enthusiastic pursuit of failure because, again, change is messy and arduous and unpredictable and full of trial and error. Perfectionism, we've come to believe, is a good thing. Imagine yourself in a last time you interviewed somebody for a job, or maybe even some time that you interviewed for, and that question always comes up of some version of what's your strengths and what's your weaknesses, or what was your biggest challenge in that situation and what are you really good at. And so people will talk about their strengths in an interview situation, and then when we ask about our weaknesses or areas of development or whatever we want to call it, a lot of interviewees will say things like, well, I'm a perfectionist, I'm a workaholic, and I'm a perfectionist, and that's my weakness. And the intention is to pitch your failure or your perfectionism, which is really, in your mind, a good thing, as a weakness. Because we've been conditioned to believe that perfectionism is somehow a virtue. Perfectionism is a vice, in my opinion, because it holds us into a place where we don't want to move forward unless we have a perfect solution. And we feel that an imperfect solution is somehow a problem solution. And in the world of implementation, there are no perfect solutions. Because most problems are adaptive, we can't have black and white solutions applied to gray problems. And so a lot of times change leaders get stalled and they get stumped and they really get frozen because of perfectionist type of thinking. And so when we get into those situations, we have to believe that perfectionism is not virtuous. It's a vice. It's something that we hold on to stay comfortable in not moving forward. So the idea is that we have to plan to fail and build failure into our plans. We have to believe that success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. Go back to principle 1, trusting the vision and relentless optimism. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. We have to increase our commitment to the vision. We have to increase our commitment to optimism. We have to increase our commitment to success and abandon the idea that we can't fail. In our brains, we have to distinguish that just because we experience failure doesn't mean we are a failure. And that is a problem with the way that we think a lot, is that we like to label ourselves as being a failure because we experience failure. And if you think back to some of your most profound learning experiences in life, and it doesn't matter whether it's a professional environment or a personal environment, stop and reflect for a second on some of the deepest learning that you've ever had in your life. When you think about some of those deep learning, think about, was that preceded by some kind of failure? And more often than not, a lot of those deep learnings are preceded by some kind of a healthy failure. And that's why I believe that we have to fail forward and fail often. We have to embrace failure as a precedent to learning. If we stop and think about this for a second, I like to think about the wave as a really good example of implementation leadership up to this point. I think we've all been to some kind of professional sporting event, whether it's NFL football or NBA or hockey or maybe college football or things like that, and you'll see the wave happen in a stadium. And here in Colorado, our Denver Broncos stadium is about 70,000 people. And who usually starts the wave in the football stadium? It's usually two people with lowered inhibitions. It's two change leaders, usually two drunk guys or two kids, neither of whom have any inhibitions. They're willing to fail. They're willing to trust this vision. They start the change initiative, and they have this really ambitious and audacious goal that the two of me, of the 70,000 people, are going to start a change to get 70,000 people to stand up, do the wave, and look kind of silly. And those change leaders really start with the right mindset of, I'm going to trust in the vision that the two of us can get 70,000 people to change. Principle number 2, they know that things are going to go wrong. They know that Murphy hates us. They know that things are going to happen. The other team is going to score a touchdown right in the middle of our wave. We know that's going to happen, and we are going to figure it out when that happens. They also know that they have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's not very comfortable to stand up in a stadium and do the wave and watch other people kind of look at you like, what are you doing? They also know that they got to fail forward and fail often. And they also know that when they confront problems, they have to adapt their responses. So what happens in the wave is this, is the two change leaders start up and they stand up and they do the wave and nothing happens. That's failure number 1. They decide to stand up again and they yell louder, and maybe 4 people stand up around them. Failure number 2. They decide, well, I failed. I'm going to stand up again and I'm going to yell louder and I'm going to recruit other people around me to do the same thing. They stand up, 4 people turns to 20, and that's failure number 3. 20 turns to 80, failure number 4. 80 people turns to 200, failure number 5. It gets bigger, failure number 6. Bigger, failure number 7. Bigger, failure number 8. Bigger, failure number 9. Bigger, failure number 10. Pretty soon they have 10,000 people in the stadium after 10 failures. Then the other team scores a touchdown. Failure. Everybody stands down. They stand back up again, and maybe only 200 stand back up. Failure number 11. They stand back up again. Failure number 12. Failure number 13. Failure number 14. Failure number 15. And 20,000 turns to 30,000, turns to 40,000, turns to 60,000. And eventually the whole stadium starts doing the wave. And it goes around and around and around, and everybody's having a good time, and the change is happening, and we got sustainable change that's happening because those two change leaders stood up and they knew that things were going to go wrong. They were committed to relentless optimism. They know their attitudes were contagious. They knew stuff was going to go wrong. They chose to be uncomfortable. They chose to fail forward and fail often, and they chose to adapt their responses. So the wave is a really good example of implementation leadership because it's about the mindset, and it's about adopting the idea that we need to fail forward in order to succeed. And what's nice about the wave is when it starts happening, those two change leaders could stand down. Those two kids, those two drunk guys that started the wave can sit down, and people will continue to move, and the change will still start happening despite those two change leaders sitting back down because people are following the followers. Implementation leadership is about adopting change, following the principles of implementation leadership with everything that we talked about and thinking about of starting the wave in your organization. So let's go back to the research a little bit. We'll get out of the example of the wave and talk about the organizational research a little bit. The organizational research has taught us that in any organization, you have about 2.5% of people that are the earliest innovators. Those are the people that are the change agents. Those are the people that don't take a lot of work to change. Those are really the change leaders that are really ambitious and audacious and trying to implement the change. And roughly speaking, that's about 2.5% of our organizations. And then the first followers are those early adopters. That's about 13.5%. And those are the people that are going to follow the first innovators. And those people are, again, fairly easy to change, fairly aligned to the evidence-based practice or aligned to the new innovation. And it doesn't take much work for them to be able to change. And leadership in that space, when you get through that first 15%, 16%, it's fairly easy. It doesn't require a lot of energy. It's kind of a natural organic change that happens. It's not until you get to that next third or that early majority, about 34% of organizations, where things start getting tough. The early majority are those people that are maybe cautiously optimistic about the change. Maybe they're just kind of passive, but they're open-minded to the change. And they're not going to change until that first 16% change. So they're really like the first followers that takes a little bit of work from a leadership perspective to really work with and really try to do some extra things. And so one of the things we have to think about as change leaders is the strategies that we adopted to get to that first 16% need to evolve as we get to the early majority. When we get to the early majority, again, we're relentlessly committed to optimism. That's trust the vision. We have to start adapting our responses. This is when we're going to start having problems in the organization. This is where we started diagnosing technical versus adaptive problems and diagnosing symptoms versus problems. This is when stuff starts getting real. And as a leader, when we get to this stage, which is sometimes years into the implementation work, we have to adapt our response as leaders. We cannot let our initial energy for the change erode when we get to this early majority, because you can imagine what happens is when we get to this early majority, or even the next stage, which is the late majority, if we start releasing our commitment to the change and kind of clutching onto our commitment to the comfort zone, that's when organizations start to fail and when we get to that 70% statistic. The tipping point in an organization is when we can get to the late majority and those people are not cautiously optimistic, they're more pessimistic. Those are the ones that are kind of doubtful about the innovation, they're doubtful about the change, they're doubtful about the success. And once an organization can get through the late majority, then the organization starts changing. And you might have 16% of laggards that don't change at all in an organization. You might have 16% of people that will never change, and that's a natural part of any organization. So the law of diffusion of innovation is important because if you think about, go back to the productive zone of disequilibrium, if your early adopters are telling you, I'm in the chaos zone, change leader, there's too much stuff going on, Because they're changing, you have to listen to that very differently than if the late majority of the laggards are telling you, hey, I'm in the chaos zone. I don't think this is going to work. This is too much. I don't really have what it takes to do this organizational change. That group is going to perform differently when they get to that chaos zone. So, as a change leader, when you're diagnosing who's having stress problems and who's having change resistance problems and who's having issues with the implementation, you have to kind of think through the law of diffusion of innovation is, am I dealing with the early innovators or am I dealing with the late majority and the laggards? And adjust your response based on that. The law of diffusion of innovation is helpful, and I often think of this of the metaphor that I think about are people in a rowboat or a canoe maybe. And say that you have 10 people in a canoe or a rowboat, and those 10 people represent 100% of the people in your organization. Well, you have two people, statistically speaking, you have about two people that are in that canoe or that rowboat, and they got their oars in the water and they're paddling hard and they're really digging into the change and they're really working hard to implement the change. And again, statistically speaking, that's about 2 out of 10 people in any organization. You also have about 2 or 3 people that are on the back of the canoe or the back of the boat, and they're rocking the boat. Those are the laggards. And those are the people that don't have their oars in the water. They're not digging into the change. They're kind of rocking the boat a little bit. And the rest of the people are kind of in the middle. You know, the other 6 people or so, they don't have their oars in the water. They're just kind of passive passengers in the boat. They're not rocking the boat. They're just kind of coasting along, but they are kind of dead weight. And as a change leader, you have to know that the people that are really got their oars in the water and they're really digging in, they're working the hardest and they're really trying hard and they're going to get burnt out. And the people that are rocking the boat, sometimes they're the ones having the most fun, and it's not helping the organization change. And the passengers, they're just kind of watching by and they're not exerting a lot of energy, not causing a lot of problems, but they're not really contributing to the change. From a leadership perspective, I believe that it's everybody's job in an organization to make it great. It's not somebody else's job to make the organization great. And so as a change leader, your job is to get the people that are rowing the boat some help and some relief. And the people that are kind of just passengers in the boat, you got to get their oars in the water. And they've got to get their oars in the water. And the people that are rocking the boat, those laggards, you might have to coach them out or you might have to coach them up and at least get them to be active passengers or preferably get them to be active rowers. In an organization, we have to be mindful of the fact that we have different people at different stages in our organizations and we have to lead a little bit differently. And for those early adopters, we have to strengthen them and support them and lead them and inspire them. And for that middle group, they need skills. They need to believe. We need to focus on the why, and we'll talk about that in a second, and really get to what is it that's driving their status as maybe cautious or pessimistic or maybe cautiously optimistic. Because there's something else going on there from a mindset standpoint. Remember, those early adopters are already motivated. And the laggards, we might have to adjust our response to them, and we might be coaching them up or coaching them out. I believe that the people who fear failure ultimately fear learning. So think about that for a second. If we fear failure and we believe that failure precedes learning, then by extension of that, we're fearing learning. We can't fear failure because we can't fear learning and growth. In order to succeed, we have to improve. To improve, we must learn. To learn, we must fail. And we have to focus on progress and not perfection. The mindset that we should adopt from a leadership perspective is that it's not about perfection. It's about progress. And if we share that with other people, if we develop the vocabulary that our organization is never about perfection but about progress, people will feel that it's okay to fail. We will forgive them if they fail forward. We have to have abundant grace in forgiving ourselves and forgiving other people and asking for forgiveness from other people when we are not at our best. And we have to just say that we are in this organization are about progress and we're never about perfection, because perfectionism is really about status quo. When we clutch to perfectionism, we're clutching to this ideal that just doesn't happen in organizations. We have to be real. If we focus on progress and not perfection, we make it okay to fail. And it helps us separate that idea of just because we experience failure doesn't mean we are a failure. There's a well-known organizational tool called Plan, Do, Study, and Act, and it's been in the organizational space for many years. And it's a very effective tool. It's essentially a rapid improvement tool, and the implementation science literature also wraps itself around the PDSA cycle, Plan, Do, Study, Act. The idea is that we plan, so we create a plan, we do it, so we implement, and we install, and we improve. And then we study, which means maybe we audit what we did, maybe we do a fidelity check, maybe we evaluate what we do, maybe we stop and think what we do, and we study what's going on, and then we act on whatever we learn in that study period. And once we act when we learn on that study period, we start saying, okay, we're going to go back into the plan stage. And when we go back into the plan stage, we say, okay, we learned in the study period that we did this wrong. We created an action on that by saying we have to adjust the response here. We have to replan, redo, restudy, react. Replan, redo, restudy, and react. And this cycle goes on and on and on in organizations, and we're continually going through these cycles to be able to get to success. And this starts to illuminate why there's not such thing as linear change, because we're in cyclical, ongoing, arduous, awkward, asymmetrical types of change. So the PDSA cycle is really about rapid improvement and kind of taking the idea that we're infinitely involved in some kind of learning. The problem I have with the PDSA cycle is there is something missing. And what is missing in here is failure. The PDSA cycle, I did not invent. I was not smart enough to invent that. If I would have invented the PDSA cycle, knowing what I know now, I would have invented it as plan, do, fail, study, act. PDFSA. Plan, do, fail, study, act. The problem with the PDSA cycle is that it makes failure taboo. It makes it covert. I want to bring failure as overt. I want to make it as an acceptable thing. Because, again, failure precedes learning. So if we adopt the PDSA cycle in our organizations, which is the right thing to do, we should adjust it and say, our job is to plan, do, fail, study, act. Plan, do, fail, study, act. Plan, do, fail, study, act. That is progress, not perfection. That is about fail forward and fail often. That makes it okay to fail. That gives people a space to say it's okay to experiment. It's okay to have trial and error. It's okay to fail because failure precedes learning. In the real world, PDFSA is what is applied to implementation in real-world community and justice settings. Principle 6, culture is king. As an implementation leader, we have to know that culture is always upstream from strategy. Strategy is our evidence-based practice, it's our program, it's our innovation, it's the thing that we're changing. Strategy is also our implementation. Culture is always upstream from our strategy. Culture drives the degree to which our organization is going to experience success or failure with our project. Peter Drucker was a pretty famous management pioneer, and even in the 1950s, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. At ACGI, we say, because of the community and justice system, that culture eats strategy for breakfast and lunch and dinner and is still hungry for more. Culture is dominant in implementation settings. Culture will always win if we don't address organizational culture. So what do we mean by organizational culture? Well, if you're mathematically minded, you might think of culture as a bit of an equation. And so say that we take an equation of inputs plus mindset. And inputs is like the people in our organization, and it's all our practices and our habits and our policies and procedures. It's all the really kind of tangible things that we put into our organization, like money and tasks and processes. So culture is that. Plus, it's the collective mindset of people. So it's the collective beliefs, attitudes, and values. It's the organizational norms from a mindset perspective. It's kind of what do you have to do around here to fit in kind of stuff. And so culture is the sum of inputs plus mindset. So it's all your people and all your habits and all your processes and all your stuff, plus the way that people think and the way that they believe and what their values are and their why. You take the sum of that and you raise it to the power of dialogue and interaction. Inputs plus mindset is strengthened, weakened, and changed by the type of dialogue and the way that people interact in an organization. It's what are they talking about at the water cooler? What is the leader talking about? What values is the leader putting out on that network? Thinking about that emotional contagion, what mindset are we putting out on that network of change? Because that has an exponential effect on the people, the inputs, the habits, the inputs, and the mindset, the beliefs, and the values of other people. So if you're mathematically minded, you might think of it of like this equation that we can change culture by changing all of this. We got to change the people, we got to change the practices, we got to change the mindset, and we got to change the way that we dialogue, and we got to change the way that we interact when it comes to culture. Because dialogue and interaction has an exponential power effect on the inputs and the mindset. Now, maybe if you're not mathematically minded, you just might think of culture as really it's what's the rules? It's an immaterial process. It's this phenomenon that doesn't consist of like just things and people and behavior, emotions. It does consist of that, but it's how those things are organized. It's the way that they're organized and almost the proportion of those things and the way that they're set up in an organization. It's the shared mental model of people and what the rules are around an organization. It's kind of what you have to know in order to operate and kind of be acceptable to other people. The thing with culture is, I think of it a lot like when you think of all the things that make up an organization, I think of those sometimes as like ingredients. And one thing I've never really understood, I consider myself a pretty good cook and I can make a pretty good meal without following a recipe. But when it comes time to baking, I don't do very well with baking because the ingredients for me don't make sense. That you can have flour and sugar and milk and eggs and butter and salt and baking soda. And it's all the same stuff, whether you make bread or cookies or cake or pastries or whatever, it's all the same ingredients, but it's the different proportion of those ingredients. It's the different relationship between those ingredients that is the difference between if you're making a bread or a muffin or a cake or something or a pie crust. They all have the same stuff, but it's the difference is the way that those things are organized, the way that those ingredients are proportioned in the organization. Organizations all have the same ingredients. They got people, they got processes, they got money, they got rules, they got a building, they got all those same things. What's different about organizations is they all have mindsets, they have beliefs and attitudes, but organization to organization, those beliefs and attitudes and mindsets are different. They're different proportions. Same ingredients, just different proportions. And the dialogue and the interaction is different as well. So from an organizational culture perspective, when we're trying to know our culture and identify our culture and diagnose it and understand it, we have to think of all those immaterial things that make up our culture. So if culture is immaterial and it's kind of ambiguous, how do we know what our culture is? The Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument, or the OCAI, is the way that we identify culture and diagnose culture and understand our culture. The research in organizations has been mixed in that it's been really hard to identify early in the days of organizational research what contributes to organizational performance. And there was a lot of research done in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s around what is it that drives organizational success. And so they found all these different components that make up organizational performance, whether it was financial performance or public service performance and things like that. And so some typology started to emerge from the literature. But what happened was the research was kind of looked at as somewhat questionable because the outcomes were all different and the methods were all different and the definition of organizational performance was all different. So it was really difficult to try to discern is what are the key ingredients of organizational success? What are the things that we do that really leads to organizational performance? So the research was fairly inconclusive, but what did emerge out of the research was some themes and some constant themes across all organizations. And the pioneers behind the OCAI and the competing values framework found that any organization is in some kind of tension between an internal focus and an external focus. An internal focus is kind of organization focused on itself and focused on its own people and focused on maybe even protecting itself or keeping itself intact. And those organizations are really integrated and they converge, meaning they take abstract information and they converge down to a more concrete solution. And then there's the other point of tension, which is being externally focused on external customers and external agencies and focused on the outside market, maybe even. And those organizations that are externally focused are really more focused on diverging from status quo. They're focused on being a little bit different so much than really kind of holding themselves into kind of being the same. There's another point of tension that you could kind of think of as a vertical axis between flexibility or stability, or another tension between discretion and control. We're always in some point of conflict between whether we're going to be flexible and we're going to be adaptable and we're about experimentation and those kinds of things, and whether our staff have a lot of discretion and judgment and autonomy in their decision making and what we do. And the thing that pulls tension against that is a desire to be more about stability and to have controlled processes and to have a lot of predictable types of things. And so organizations struggle between being flexible and giving their staff a lot of discretion, or being more about stable and having more processes that are about kind of organizational control. When we put these two axes together, we now have the competing values framework. The competing values framework is an underlying framework that lives underneath the OCAI to show you how your organization performs on these 2 points of tension. There are some organizations that are internally focused and flexible. So think about that for a second, of an organization that is really about giving their people discretion and being flexible and maybe even being more collaborative because they're focused on themselves, and so they really value their people and they really value people in general, and they're kind of focused on their own kind. And those organizations that are both internally focused and also flexible and give discretion, we can maybe think of that as the collaborate culture. That is the type of organization, the type of culture that is really focused on using everybody's mind in the organization to be able to make a decision or to be able to do certain things in the work. We also have organizations that are still about flexibility and they're still about giving staff discretion, but they're a little bit more externally focused and they're a little bit more about diverging or differentiating from status quo. And those type of organizations that are still flexible but kind of more externally focused, we can kind of think of that as the create culture. Those organizations are a little bit more cutting edge, a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more experimental. They're more innovative, they're more creative, because they're really focused on kind of diverging from status quo and kind of focused on whatever's out there in the world. You also have our organizations that are internally focused, so again, focused on themselves, and also they're focused on stability and control. They're really focused on predictable processes and having really predictable rules and predictable operational policies, and really kind of protecting some of those policies because they're internally focused, really about protecting and holding stable some of those internal processes. And you can kind of think of that culture as the control culture. And then there's organizations that are more about stability and control, but also externally focused. And so those organizations are kind of looking out to the market, and they're really about kind of exercising some control over the environment and control over the market. And they're a little bit more focused on kind of stretching the targets, and they're focused about change, but they're also focused about kind of capturing things in order to stay stable as an organization. You know, they kind of focus on their market share. They focus on these really audacious goals and really try to have a very athletic type of approach to their work. So any organization has attributes to all 4 of these attributes. We're always in points of tension between all these different 4 areas. And we can paint a picture of an organization with the OCAI that gives us a picture of how much of us is collaborative, how much of us is creative, how much of us is competitive, and how much of us is about control. And the OCAI helps us do that. Once we administer the OCAI, we teach people to do this in the academy. We can get that picture and we start educating people about how to interpret and how to kind of diagnose their outcomes on the OCAI. So let's go just a little bit deeper into the different typologies of the OCAI. And we're going to talk about that yellow profile, or the create culture, that again is externally focused and flexible. The create profile, or we can kind of think of that as an ad hoc culture and adhocracy culture, is really innovative and transformation minded, and they're very creative and very about adaptive types of leadership. They're very agile and they focus on the future, and they're held together by a common vision. Because they're externally focused and they're focused on that future, they're not so much about today and the way that the organization is today. They're about how they want the organization to be in the future. And those type of cultures, they love to experiment. And the people in those cultures, when you hire staff for those type of cultures and the members of those organizations, they're not there to just do a job. They're there to also create ideas. And those types of cultures like to give members autonomy and welcome ideas for the staff that are in an organization. And those type of organizations, they really welcome diverse opinions. They like having conflict in their decision making because they know that the best ideas are the kind of the sum of the way that we all think as members of an organization. They're really focused on agility, and they're focused on flexibility, and they're more about pitching a tent more than building a palace, which means that kind of this temporary ad hoc type of thing that you can pitch a tent pretty much anywhere. If you build a palace, you're pretty stuck wherever that palace is. And so the ad hoc or the create culture is really about kind of pitching that tent and seeing where it goes and picking up and packing up and going to the next thing. And so they're really inviting of risks, and they like dynamic approaches, and they like to vary. They like to think outside the box, so to speak. And in those organizations, the leaders are really they're the inspiring people, and they're also the idea people, and they're championing change in their organization. And those people in those organizations, if there was a bumper sticker that kind of typified the yellow culture or the create culture, they would say that the best way to kill an idea is to develop a policy and procedure. The part of our culture that is creative doesn't like policy and procedure, because policy and procedure can lock us away from creativity. And the ad hoc cultures really try to diverge from policy and procedure. Now, in opposition to the create culture or the yellow culture is the green culture, or that we'll call the control profile. And again, that's the one that's more internally focused and more about stability. This culture is more about the hierarchy. They're more about the rules. And so the green culture or the control or hierarchy culture is really held together by really capable processes and logistics. They're very technically minded. They're very about technical types of leadership. The type of leadership in really heavy control cultures are really about technical processes, and the decision making in control cultures is very structured and it's very centralized, and it's kind of top down, and the idea is that members conform to all the controls and the structures of any organization. You can think of like military and law enforcement and prisons and jails that have a lot of rules to keep itself safe, and they have a standard operating procedure for everything in their organization. So these type of cultures are really metrics and measurement minded, and they're more risk averse. The green or control cultures they're more about reducing risks and preventing risks. They're not about inviting risks. A lot of the control culture profile is really about avoiding risks through capable processes and through capable procedures. So their values are really about predictability and kind of rigorously tested models and rigorously tested procedures. They put a lot of value on being efficient and being consistent and being uniform and being predictable. They believe that errors are kind of a departure. They don't like to tolerate errors. A lot of times control cultures like to capture errors and really try to correct those errors, and they really believe in kind of getting it right. And in these types of cultures, innovations achieved very incrementally, just a little bit at a time, because they're so locked into status quo and kind of holding on to some of these really structured processes. They really try to eliminate variation, and the leadership role in these types of cultures are really about being the coordinator and the organizer and the monitor. They're really kind of watching to make sure that these capable processes are followed. And if there was a bumper sticker of the green culture, it would maybe be something like there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way, and we do things the right way for organizations that are really heavy in the control profile. And sometimes the green cultures, they get a bit of a bad rap. Sometimes people think that it's a bad thing, but there are really successful aspects to the hierarchy culture. McDonald's, for example, has quite a bit of control to some of their organization, in that you can go to McDonald's anywhere in the country and the food looks the same, it's called the same thing, it tastes the same. No matter where you go, McDonald's always tastes the same. And that's because they have highly standardized food preparation, and they like to hire young employees to follow all the 350-page manual about how you cook the food. And they have very structured processes about exactly where they buy their food from, and exactly how the food is prepared, and exactly what temperatures, and exactly how long, and exactly what order things go on. And there's a certain production flow to the way that they do things, so that if you get a Big Mac at McDonald's in Georgia, it's the same as getting a Big Mac in Los Angeles, or the same as getting a Big Mac in Canada. And it's because of their predictable, capable processes, and because McDonald's is McDonald's no matter where you go, they've been pretty successful. To get promoted in McDonald's, the supervisors have to be able to pass a test on a 350-page rule manual, and they have to know all those capable processes and procedures, and they have their staff wear uniforms. They even have them say the same things to customers, and they practice their speech when they're talking to customers and things like that. Ford is kind of known in the same way. And so some hierarchy cultures can be really successful because they have really predictable processes. In the world of organizational change, however, these companies don't really move fast. They don't change super fast. Now, the blue culture, or the compete profile, is again externally focused and stable. We can call this the market culture. They have a much more athletic approach to their work. They're more about speed, and they like to defeat others, and they're about winners and losers, and they're not so much about agility as they are about speed and short-term wins. And they kind of believe that the outside environment is hostile and their job is to go out and get some of it. So they want to be really quick to get to solutions, and they want to stretch those targets, and they want to kind of high value on their members that are really the producers of something bigger. And so they really kind of see their members as the kind of people that do the same thing so that the organization can move forward and kind of penetrate the market. Their members are not really idea generators. Their members are doers. Their members are soldiers. And so this type of organization is really about achievement and the bottom line. They like to be the best. This might be the part of your organization that maybe has a little bit of competition with other systems and kind of looking at other systems and saying, we can be better than that, or we can do better than that. And in these type of cultures, the leadership are really the hard drivers. They're really the kind of driving, production-oriented, aggressive mindset type of leaders. And so in these type of organizations, if there was a bumper sticker, it would say that it's better to aim high and miss the mark than to aim low and hit it. These type of cultures believe that we should have really audacious goals and stretch ourselves to get these really audacious goals, that we should aim high and be willing to miss, then aim low and be willing to hit. And then the red culture, which is kind of oppositional to the blue, internally focused and flexible, is really about collaboration. So they're very egalitarian. They're very community-minded, where everybody gets input on the decision, and they're really focused on care for each other, and they have a sense of we. They really kind of view the external customers as partners, but they view themselves as an organization as kind of like a little family. And they're held together by human development and personal growth and, kind of organizational, maybe even family values. So they're very cohesive and morale driven. They're about kind of self-care, and they're focused on employee engagement and satisfaction more than they are on market share. They might be focused on their own organizational health before they're focused on their organizational types of outputs. So they're really held together by these shared values and tradition and partnership. And, they have a lot of rituals in these organizations where to kind of conform to the organization, you have to kind of conform to some of these really human rituals. And these organizations can be a little bit slower moving sometimes because they like to get consensus on things, and they like to experiment with different types of ideas. And they have really high values on the leader being really the connector and the mentor and the team builder, and really about developing people and the health of the way that people collaborate in an organization. And in these type of cultures, management really empowers the people to make decisions. The managers kind of view that you are the decision makers and I'm just the facilitator of your organizational health. And these type of cultures believe that handshakes are more powerful than contracts. Contracts are something that the green culture uses, or maybe the blue culture uses, but this kind of culture, they believe, is I don't need a contract. You give me a handshake, I'm going to go off of trust. If you think of a handshake, the original gesture of a handshake between two people was to show that you don't have a weapon. It was a gesture of trust. And the red culture, the collaborate or clan culture, is really about that trust. It's about extending trust to its members and really believing in the health of the people of the organization. So when we kind of step away and we do the OCAI, we can see the picture of our organization, of how much of us is in the red or the collaborate culture where we do things together, how much of us is in the blue where we're about doing things fast and doing things better, how much of us is in the yellow where we're about creative and doing new things, and then how much of us is in the green, which is about doing things right and doing things with really controlled processes. And organizations are all of these things in their organizations. Rarely are organizations any one thing or another. We're really different ingredients or different proportions of these different points of tension. And so the OCAI helps us get that picture. We did some research here in Colorado on several different criminal justice organizations, and they were measured with the OCAI to give us a picture of their culture. And we also measured them with their performance on some implementation science drivers. And the drivers are the 9 things that you see on the screen, ranging from staff selection, training, and coaching, all the way through facilitative administration and decision data support. And those are essentially the 9 evidence-based drivers of implementation science from the National Implementation Research Network. The idea is that organizations that do better on these domains have higher implementation success in the implementation science. And so when you put these 2 scales together on any single organization and on this group of organizations, this is what we found. When you see the data, you'll see an asterisk, and that means it's a statistically significant relationship. When you don't see an asterisk, that means it's not statistically significant. And when you see the kind of gray or light blue shaded areas, that means there's a statistically significantly positive relationship between culture and implementation. So for example, You can see like the clan culture and the adhocracy culture do pretty well on the implementation science drivers. There's a statistically significantly positive relationship between clan and adhocracy cultures with the implementation science drivers. Now, when you get to the market culture, there's kind of a neutral relationship. There's kind of inconclusive relationship between the market cultures and the implementation science drivers. But when we get to the hierarchy cultures, in the purple, there's a statistically significantly negative or inverse relationship, which essentially means that cultures that are predominant in hierarchy have an inverse relationship or a negative relationship with implementation performance. So if we step on that for a second and we think of many kind of stereotypical criminal justice situations, we have a lot of hierarchy to our cultures. That means our culture is going to be more slow to change and have more rules and processes that have to change in order for us to experiment. And this is why we start to understand some of the data of why organizations have such high failure rates. As organizations get bigger, they get more controlled and more structured. As organizations grow, they get more stable. As organizations start up, they're a little bit more yellow, right? They're a little bit more red, and they start kind of experimenting and figuring themselves out. The hierarchy cultures, the control cultures, the stability and control and internally focused cultures don't do really well with change. And we have to work harder and differently in the criminal justice system in order to use good implementation science strategies. So this starts to signal to us that our culture can drive our implementation, and our implementation can drive our outcomes, maybe more so than the evidence-based practice itself. It might not be the evidence-based practice that's failing. It might be our implementation that's failing. It might be our leadership that's failing, and it might be our culture that's failing. So implementation leadership is intended to help us have the right mindset and the right skills so that we can know our culture and diagnose our culture, use good implementation science, and get good outcomes with our practices. So you might be thinking, okay, my culture might be hierarchical, my culture might be market. I don't know what my culture is. At ACGI, we have a different training that we do called Ideate training, and it essentially teaches people how to identify and diagnose their culture, and we give people some tools on how to change culture. In the Implementation Leadership Academy itself, we actually teach people how to do the OCAI, and we give them a tool and they score it on themselves, and that's what we do in the Academy version of Implementation Leadership. And the Ideate framework is a separate thing that teaches people how to change culture with the different tools, which we don't have time to go into in a webinar format for Implementation Leadership.
So now we've covered principles 4 through 6. You've learned that we must discern between technical and adaptive problems and adapt or die. We learn the importance of healthy failure as an antecedent to learning in fail forward and fail often. And we learn the sobering truth that culture is king when it comes to organizational change and implementation. Remember that lasting, meaningful change requires resilience and a new way of leading rather than managing change. Remember that your leadership mindset's a contagion for others that you lead. In Part 3, we'll cover the final 4 principles of implementation leadership. Add these new ones to your leadership vocabulary for a while, and you'll see how it drives a new mindset for healthy, adaptive change. We'll see you soon for Part 3.